Welcome to our second class. Last class we discussed why are we doing this ecclesiology class, and we saw that ecclesiology experienced a big explosion in 20th century. The 20th century is rightly called the century of ecclesiological renaissance. And while the rest of Christianity has been involved in creating very comprehensive and meaningful accounts of the church, Adventism neglected this particular line of inquiry because they felt that Christ will come so quickly that we don't have time now to reflect on who are we as a messenger. Our message is important, what we preach, but not necessarily who we are in the process. So this question is always secondary in Adventist thinking. First is the question of proclamation of the news, of the message. Always the identity question comes as a secondary one, but we do have our perception of who we are. Now, we also realize that currently we have global challenges, challenges of unity, challenges of relevance, and challenges of interaction with other Christian and non-Christian denominations that are forcing us to engage more deeply in ecclesiology. The moment you start to talk about the nature of church and ecclesiology and who we are, what's the point of this church, what's the role of the church in the world, that's the moment when you discover that you can't have very objective theological language, one which is technically happening somewhere there in objective realm. There is a spectator which is untouched by history and different conditions, sociological conditions, psychological condition. We can't have this kind of abstract talk. It's always happening within certain kind of context. So your experience of the church will actually shape your language about the church, thus your theology of church or your ecclesiology. And you will notice in this class that the way you perceive your identity and who you are as a community, which is thoroughly an ecclesiological question, the way your prior notions, your prior preconceptions or assumptions about the nature of Adventist identity will shape the selection of different Bible metaphors that you use to technically describe who you are. So you're not coming as a neutral observer. We all are born in certain contexts, we are shaped by the church, and this experience shapes our language about the church. And the moment we try to articulate this language, this can also shape our experience of the church. Therefore, it's impossible to do this kind of ecclesiological inquiry and this kind of module without paying attention to the context where we are today. And this is how we're going to start to reason about theology of church. First, let's see where we are, try to analyze ourselves, to deconstruct our worldview, and then we'll be in position to discuss the language that we use for our ecclesiology, which is our next stage, So what's our ecclesiology? Perception of identity or self-understanding. And then we can try to see the ways how we can enhance that and how we can really, really advance our language about the church. So, talking about Adventism, I entitled this lesson Adventism at the Crossroads, Current Tensions and Issues, because by analyzing different aspects of Adventism today globally, you can notice that Adventism cannot be labeled with a single etiquette, a single label, Adventism. But it's more, we are talking about Adventisms, plural. Okay? So there's a multiplicity of Adventism today. There is no one solution. When I ask this question I ask to many people in different countries, I get so many different answers. So what does it mean to be a Seventh-day Adventist? Try to answer from your own personal experience. So for you, what does it mean actually that you are a Seventh-day Adventist? So how would you define that? Is there somebody who can be bold enough to kind of express in a few sentences, what do you mean by Seventh-day Adventist? At the moment, there is no right and wrong answer. It's just for you, personally, what does it mean? Yes, great.
I guess for me, like when I try to really go down to the core of it, mm-hmm. It all boils down to a unique set of doctrines that really identify Seventh-day Adventist as Seventh-day Adventist, mm-hmm. not just Christian or another denomination, but what is Seventh-day Adventist. Mm-hmm. No matter what I say, when I say, but what does that mean? It comes down to doctrines. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I guess that's what it means to me.
And what would be those key doctrines that you would usually list to other Christians, let's say, to explain how are you different than them? So what would be the doctrines you would technically list?
The Sabbath is
okay.
Outstanding.
Yes. 7th day.
Yes.
And then we have Adventists, technically second coming, exactly. What other things are very specifically Adventist? Sanctuary. Remnant. Is there something else? State of the dead?
Yeah.
Yeah. three angel message, so they're
Help
all
Spirit of
message.
prophecy.
Help
spirit of
message.
prophecy as expressed in the ministry of Ellen G. White. Yeah. So those are certain doctrines that you would list to describe how you differ from other forms of Christianity, yeah? Is there maybe some other solution also here? How would you explain to a person who is maybe Christian, the person who knows who Christ is, what Christ did, but you want to say, okay, this is how what I bring to the table. This is something distinctively which I stand for.
Lifestyle and morals.
Mm-hmm. So Adventism is much more than just doctrines. It's a certain way of lifestyle, talking about holism, that how we eat influences the way how we maybe sleep, or our spirituality, how we think and emotions. Everything comes together. We can't separate spirituality from our domain, our daily life. Okay, well done, Oliver. Who else? I think when we push this question further, if you want to even go more specific, we'll get many, many different answers. When I ask this question to different groups, draw up a model, visual representation of Adventist identity, when I give this task, but somehow for them to distinguish those essential elements from those that are less essential, and I get so many different answers in different countries. And I tested this, and what I realized is when I put those answers together, I could differentiate at least 6 or 7 different strands or fractions, different ways of being Adventist, different lifestyles which are competing. When you came to Newbold, we came from more than 30, 40 nationalities here, and then you experience a cultural shock, because what was Adventism in your country is not Adventism here. I mean, for me, it was also a shock. I come from Serbia, and I remember I technically did not have a practice of going to cinema. I first time started here when I was here. And some people in Serbia, when you see you drinking coffee or doing some other things, they will see you as somehow less faithful, or there are different versions of how Sabbath is actually kept. Some people are cooking on Sabbath and spending time with family in that particular, we are doing it together, or going to a restaurant and actually paying for it. Other people prepare everything on Friday. So there's a big confusion in my head. So what's going on? Are we all Adventists? And then usually we have this idea that somehow our kind of Adventism is more logical and more holy, and everybody else apostatizes or know this not as good as we do. Okay, so we come with this kind of attitude, and later when we engage with others, we're realizing, okay, there are different ways how loyalty to God can be expressed. But I'm talking about this externally. When you look at Adventism, you can distinguish a very different sorts of things. This is a creature with many heads, and therefore, before we start to talk about ecclesiology, we need to kind of see where we are. We all come from a particular context. In the beginning, I mentioned that your context will influence your ecclesiological talk. Sometimes we think that we are so objective, like a scientist. Scientists, they have their tubes, and they're examining the nature of, this substance that they're examining, maybe a water, and they think they are in control because they can see it objectively. But they are not aware that they're standing on a small boat, and this boat is actually led by the current of the river. So there's water actually in control of them instead of them controlling the water. You know what I mean? Sometimes we are so controlled with our ideas, with our societies, our cultures, which happens to be our lenses through which we see reality, upon which we act, okay? So our culture shapes us to that degree that we are not aware of it. So we think that this is the way we see is how things are, but we are not aware of those filters. We are not aware that we actually stand in a boat and we are taken by the river, much wider and bigger river than what we can imagine. So today we are going to identify those rivers within Adventism to see what's shaping us. This is going to be like a mirror to us. This lecture particularly aims to help you to see your own face in your own mirror, okay, to see, I now understand, I come from that particular aspect of Adventism. But also can help you to understand the theological priorities that exist beside your group of Adventists, so you can start to have a meaningful dialogue with others. This can also help you as pastors to know how to relate to a particular congregation. If you had the task to travel internationally and to speak to different audiences, you will notice how this knowledge is actually quite handy, because by knowing who you talk to, you can adjust your language to make sense within their own context. Okay, so it widens your perception of Adventism. Okay, let's go for it. This is how I see a complex series of decisions that we have to make in order to navigate Adventism. It's like a big roundabout. This happened to be one of the most complex roundabouts in the world in England, next to Swindon, and there is also one next to Hemel Hempstead. So these are 4 smaller roundabouts within one big one. So try to drive there. Look, this is how it looks like from Google Map. So technically, if you are here, you want to go to a certain direction, you need to know exactly what decision to make at which point. If you make one wrong decision, you're out of this, and you have to go back into a roundabout. No wonder why insurance companies earn so much money on this roundabout. There is a lot of car crash happening here. I remember my first experience of roundabout, one simple roundabout, just here when you go towards Bracknell. I got from my friend a pink Cinquecento, which was a very small car. You can technically wipe the back side of the car with just sitting in the driver's seat. I must say it wasn't really a masculine car. Pink and so small. People were laughing when I'm entering the campus. I got it, so I used it. And I thought I was right to always use, they just told me, remember left side, okay? Left side is the right side here. And then I tried to drive through this roundabout, and then instead of going to a left track here, I went into left track, but on the other side like that. Luckily, there was nobody there. And often we navigate through Adventism like that, simply because of the lack of information. So today we're going to get this information. How do we navigate rightly? So this is how it looks like. This roundabout. If you make wrong choices, Adventism is technically going to disintegrate in the future. We won't be able to navigate the complex changes. We won't be able to answer the challenge of unity, relevance in the world, which changed significantly since the time of the beginning of the movement, as well as we won't be able to interact with other people in a meaningful and fruitful way. So first, we have a first and more basic form of Adventism, which somehow dates in 1844 when the movement emerged. We call them historical Adventists or historical Adventism. First 40 years, the main identity question which shaped their river, the river that is taking them, okay, was the question of what is Adventist in Adventism? So what really makes us different from other Christians? Remember, this is happening to the Christians in Northern America. They were all Protestant, almost all of them Protestant, running away from Europe to have freedom to exercise their faith. So they all know about Christ and saved by grace, accepted by faith, and so on. So they know this common Christian language. So Adventists in that context, they do not have to prove some beliefs which were accepted as by default. Okay, but they had to emphasize what is the new thing that you're bringing to a dialogue. So they emphasize specific doctrines, which were formed in 1945 already, very quickly after the Great Disappointment, 22nd of October, 1844, after 6 Sabbath conferences. They met and they discussed, saying, these are the 5 beliefs which we could call doctrinal pillars of our faith. All of them happen to start with S. Sabbath, sanctuary, or Christ's investigative judgment. And then there would be what? State of the dead, Second coming. Yes, spirit of prophecy. Well done, So this is something which was seen in the beginning as the core of our identity. And 40 years they spent consolidating and refining those, adding different dimensions and trying to see their mutual connection, to integrate their doctrinal beliefs. And this is what defined their mission and identity. They were very zealous in their preaching, This is what they were arguing, organizing public debates, sharing the pamphlets. They knew exactly what they stand for. This was more or less united movement at a time, one strand of Adventism. This is what it means to be Adventist. And more they were defending their distinctiveness. But then, this emphasis on historical aspect, of Adventism, emphasis on those beliefs, led them in some kind of tension with other Christians. Because rarely ever were they talking about Christ and salvation, so they were perceived as sect or as a cult. Their main topics were 144,000, mark of the beast, Armageddon, and you can imagine all the texts from Revelation, which are a bit esoteric and a bit peculiar to people who never met this before. So they were perceived as a very weird people. But they at least had something to stand for. They knew what they believe. Today, we have this strand also present today. People who usually quote pioneers and want to come to this golden period of church life, when everything was pure, and then the church forgot what they believed. They experienced apostasy. We want to go back to these original beliefs, of Adventism. And then they ask the question, when was the last time you heard the sermon about the signs of the times, or the Armageddon, or who is the beast? Why don't we critique Pope openly anymore? So Adventism is losing its roots, its fundamental vision, And so we have these people today. Often, they will be the one who would be complaining when you bring a new worship style, or when you try to have a conversation with other Christians. Immediately, you're a communist. You're a person who is going to lose the faith, Don't do that. Don't read other books, non-Adventist books should be censored, So
Are these people also called historical still?
Yeah, they are more like they want to go back into this particular mindset, but in their methodology, I would call them reversionists. Reversionists, meaning that you go back, you go back in order to reform the present. So you can be a reversionist in a sense of you go back as far as apostolic tradition, you think that this is a golden period, you want to imitate that, and then you assume that the whole history is a history of devolution, or there is a certain degradation of the church and apostasy, and you want to bring the people where you are today, to bring them to where apostles were. In this case of historical Adventists, we want to bring them back to our pioneers. So often in church you will hear the phrases like revival and reformation, and then what does it actually mean? Going back to our roots, remembering the old ways, okay? Want to say?
Like restoration.
Yes, like restorationist approach. And everything new will be perceived as a danger. So we already emphasized that those people usually know what they stand for. They are good, solid, doctrinally informed Adventists. They can shoot at you 1,000 verses to prove that the Sabbath is the right day, okay? But at the same time, certain doctrinal mistakes that happen at that particular period reoccur today. Because in this package, they don't think critically to evaluate. They think that everything is so great. So they forget the following tensions and very distortive aspect of belief. First, anti-Trinitarianism. And now I know that there is a huge problem in Bosnian church. People, like more than half of them, Oliver knows because his dad is currently the president there. People leaving the church and pioneers of this particular ministry in Bosnia, they're accepting this kind of belief. The Trinity is just an invention of the Catholic Church. We should come back to the original belief of our Adventists, and they did not really believe in a full-fledged Trinitarian theories. So they say, okay, they're skeptical towards Trinity. And I can see how this is spreading everywhere. This is not just a matter of Bosnia. I can see it in Eastern Europe, even here in England. Last year I've been invited to come to America to actually confront some churches. 50% of the church leaving the church because they think the church apostatized. We are not preaching our original message. And usually in this anti-Trinitarian theory, we have doubt that the Holy Spirit is a person. And also there is semi-Arianism. Christ is not God, he is just simply man, a very good man, superior to everybody else, but not really God. He's firstborn. So there was time in history when he did not exist. So the Arian heresy from the 4th century is found its doors to the pioneers' teaching, to those historical Adventists today. So I'm not talking here about something which is very abstract and part of the past. You will face this as leaders in the church. This will be Adventists who will usually have those distortions. Anti-Trinitarianism, semi-Arianism, but also there is a whole package which we called LGT. You know what LGT is? Last Generation Theology, later developed by Andreasen. Perfectionist theory, that God will have his people who will attain the perfection of the character of Christ. And because they attain this perfection, Christ will come. And Christ is not coming because we are not good enough, technically. Once he sees his character perfectly revealed in a church, to quote the sentence of Ellen G. White, once Christ sees that, then he will come. So they took this sentence of Ellen White out of the context of her entire theory of mediation of Christ as a high priest. And they technically believe that you have a calling as Christians to attain perfection, and on the basis of that perfection, you are accepted to kingdom. So perfectionist theory, and usually is associated with a high emphasis on legalism. So eliminate your sinful actions. Everything is so behavioral centered. Those Adventists, we come to you and say, you can't be Christian and wear this short skirt, or have this jewelry here, or have this and that. Constantly you feel these guilt trips next to them. because they have a standard in their head how those pioneers were dressed. And now in 21st century, we cannot go astray and, find our own special way of being Christian. We need to go back to that. And so you can see this is not only a theological project, it's also a lifestyle project. We want to retrieve all the habits, even dress like Ellen G. White if any possible, On the other side, now we have the second. Do you have any question regarding those? Is it clear how you can identify them? Do you know the people like that?
Yes.
Okay. So the danger of this map is it's going to provide you with very nice labels to label the people and also often caricature them. So I'm talking about spectrum. Not everything is so caricatured. There are people who simply want to affirm certain theological stance of early Adventists, but they are avoiding the heresies, okay? I'm just saying if you go into this direction that you want to retrieve everything from history, there's a lot of things which our pioneers believed, and we don't believe it anymore. When I read some of those documents, I'm thinking, oh, what on earth happened here? How did I come to that conclusion, It's almost sometimes embarrassing, But this is a story of real people, messy people, who are, discovering step by step, progressively discovering the truth from the Bible. So we should see this journey as a progressive search for truth. And what comes before is not necessarily better than what comes later. When you are more mature, when you have better perception of reality, you will nuance your claim. You will see that things are not as black and white. So why would somebody dig into your past and retrieve some of the old statements that you said? Because what you say now is more relevant than what you said before. You're simply more mature spiritually. So the whole logic, I think, it's positioned on a very bad foundation, assumption about how relation functions. What was before was better than now. Why? Why would you claim that? Okay, so 40 years we have a unified Adventism. Now we're going into the second stage, 1888. What happened then? Ellen G. White calls this date one of the saddest chapters in the history of God's people. Saddest chapters. The Conference of Minneapolis, exactly. Young guys, Wagner Jones and A.T. Jones, they came to this big, huge tent, of Adventists who were like pillars of faith. They're defending their beliefs, and they simply felt that there is no Jesus in all this. We want Jesus. We want to have this personal experience with Him. What about grace? They're insisting so much on 10 Commandments and on Sabbath. Why don't we talk more about this personal relationship with Jesus? Like other Christians. So they started to ask a different question. What is Christian in Adventism? Not only what is Adventist in Adventism, but what is Christian in Adventism? What helps us to recognize our common identity with other Christians? So it's a very legitimate question because after all, we are Christians following Christ, okay? And then they agreed, okay, first you go and you're going to read this verse, and then I'll go, and then you go, like 17 times. We're going to make a statement. Hey, people, we forgot the Bible and the emphasis of the Bible. Look at the scripture, the witness to Christ, He Himself said. But you forgot that Christ. You think you have salvation in your doctrines, and you will not. So they caused a bit of a rebellion then. After that particular Congress, meeting in Minneapolis, we had two fractions. On one side, people emphasizing and defending the original doctrines, distinctive doctrines. On the other side, people trying to draw them to the center of Jesus Christ and love and being justified by faith, and all this language of justification is part of that package. Now, Ellen G. White says, instead of those two groups seeing themselves as two cheeks of the same face, the divide remained. They saw themselves as opposing parties in a church. Unfortunately, due to the immediate crisis, such as Kellogg crisis, Holy Flesh movement, and then we have the period of reorganization of the church in 1901, 1903, and then the First World War, and one after the other, things were coming, and then never properly set together to see how they are complementing each other. Because after all, they're talking about the same thing. You need evangelical stream of Adventism, this second stream. You need this evangelical to emphasize the gospel, evangelion, to emphasize Christ, because He's the center of our faith. But you also need historical, because historical tells you where Christ is today in His sanctuary, what He's up to, when He is coming. So all of Adventist doctrines are actually thoroughly Christ-centered. So they are not opposing project. this is something which was missing in a first preaching, 40 years. They're just bringing back, supplementing the vision in a second direction. Here, those Adventists are slightly more also inclusive towards other Christians, because the main identity question is what is Christian in Adventism? This will also shape their theological language about the church. While these historical Adventists, they talked about church as a watchman, waiting for Christ's coming. Church as a 10 virgins story. Through that story, we shouldn't sleep. Church as remnant, okay, because we call for this particular time to preach this particular message. Evangelicals will more switch from this eschatological emphasis, this emphasis on the future. They will switch to the emphasis on today. How do I live with Christ today? We are the body of Christ. There's almost nothing eschatological in it, except the fullness of this body will be reflected in the future, Body of Christ, temple of the Spirit, salt in the world. That means they started to think about questions about how do I influence the world around me? I can't just ignore our present reality. Evangelicals thought about it. I can't just ignore it because I have my duty towards other, even non-Christians in the world, towards politics, towards society, towards earth. I have my duties while waiting for Christ to come. No, but they do not see themselves as the same part of the same movement. They are now two polarizing bodies. Why am I talking about this? This discussion was not resolved at a time, and it's something which is plaguing Adventism today. You will always have those tendencies be fought for, Now I'm going to name something, not personal names, but you heard about GYC, and you heard about Project One. Where would you put them on this spectrum? Historical or evangelical?
Like which one on what side?
Yes.
Well, GYC is historical, right?
Yes. Even the way they do the evangelism, knocking on the doors, selling the books, the topics they're covering, and the way they dress, their music, it's a proper Adventism, like historical Adventists. While Project One is what? More evangelical, Christ the center of every doctrine, and then those two are creating such a havoc around. People are constantly writing, let's say, to TED to ask, so who is right, which one is good, And then once you side yourself with one particular party, let's say, especially if you side yourself with Project One, you will get a lot of emails. I myself was getting a lot of emails. If you want to publish in particular publication that's associated with one of those two, just watch out. You'll have a lot of enemies because people still live in trenches today. Even now, just a simple choice, we had to make a decision about who will be the main speaker of Valencia Congress. So there is like 20 people discussing that. So the name came out, but the name was associated with more evangelical strand. Then we got angry emails. Sometimes you wonder, how can they still be called Christians, and have these threats there in their email like that, saying, we will not bring our youth if you bring that person. You need to bring that and that person. So then we had to, for political reasons, bring another person who is balancing their needs and speaking to their concerns. And then in the end, this turned out to be like 60 people involved as speakers, and you need to exactly know to please all those groups, plus gender issues, plus racial issues, plus, the decision gets very complicated. What I'm saying here is we often perceive ourselves as really separate from each other. In reality, there a way of seeing this as a part of the same project. But this is our reality. There will be those emphases around. And I think you as future leaders need to know what church has what tendency, and then to know how to speak their language and try to lead them towards the middle more. Okay? So now, things would be easy if this is the only intersection that we have. But as we said in the beginning, it's like a Swindon intersection. You have multiple smaller intersections within this roundabout. Things get complicated when we come to 1920s. 1920s, suddenly we have two more strands emerging. On one side, fundamentalists. On the other side, progressives. So why 1920s? This was the decade where there was a huge watershed in Northern America. Watershed meaning like there was those scientists and this modernist mindset, and liberal theologians. And on the other side, there were those fundamentally strong, people fighting for orthodoxy and for the past values, traditional values. Those more on liberal side, more progressives, they were saying about They were talking about, Bible, this is actually as any other human book, written by people in their, they're very, very conditioned culturally and historically. So this is not necessarily the word of God, even not inspired necessarily by God. It's just a human effort to describe something which maybe or maybe not didn't happen to them. So they're trying to minimize this supernatural element of inspiration as well of the event itself. So when they read the book of Noah and they see the guy, is he really swallowed up by the fish and survived 3 days in the middle of the ocean? Or Jesus, resurrection, really, birth of Jesus, like from virgin, of course. Possibly just don't know who the partner was, but it can't be just a virgin giving a birth to Christ. So they're asking those questions, which are quite like a reasonable questions, looking from the naturalistic point of view. And they're shaking the foundations of Christianity suddenly. They're following, theologians on that side were like Schleiermacher, who came much before. You heard about him, and other liberal theologians, Bultmann, let's say, who tried to demythologize the New Testament, to take out all the myths of the Bible and legends and just leave the truth, that the Bible wants to communicate. Yes?
I just have a question about what are the connections and differences between historical fundamental and evangelical and progressive? Because it seems like fundamental sounds close to historical. Is that right? Or is are they very different actually?
Yes. So it seems that you rightly noticed that there are certain links. More progressives would more align with evangelicals in their inclusiveness, while fundamentally is almost like a intensified, almost perverted historical Adventism. They added certain beliefs which were not necessarily part of early pioneers, but they actually insisted on that. Let me just... beliefs, one time?
Which beliefs?
Which beliefs? Okay. So there is a belief in inerrancy of Bible. That's the key term being used, inerrancy of the Bible. Even in our doctrinal expression, when we had 23 beliefs in 1931, the second belief about the Sabbath was we believe in inerrant word of God. There is no mistakes. Why? Because God was dictating every single word of the Bible to the human author. So he technically suppressed all the human cultural elements, even personal characteristics of the author, to pass the pure and undefiled will of God, which is a timeless truth. So when you read the Bible, there is no context, there is no need for context, because this is the same meaning for all times, for all places. Those people tend to emphasize their verbal inspiration of the Bible and dictation theory, while progressives would rather claim that, no, biblical authors, they were inspired people, possibly talented people, maybe people with certain elevated spiritual sense, who then just were left on their own to write the text. Therefore, progressives were claiming we need to also use science as a possible source of knowledge, to use also other social sciences as well as philosophy, and then Bible is one of them, but we need to use them all. So this is a multiple source theory that I'm bringing. While fundamentalists, they defend Bible and only Bible, nothing else. So let me just give you a gist of it so you can answer your question more precisely. Let's say there was a country which I traveled to 3 years ago. They had a situation of a guy who felt pedophilic tendencies. He happened to be in a leadership position. So he did not do the act, anything, but he was tempted. And then he reads the Gospel of Matthew. And there it says, cut the member of your body which is a blasphemy to you and which is stumbling block to you. So he is a fundamentalist. There's no context, this is what God wants me to do. So he cut the parts which can lead him to sin. In the end, the church still found out what happened, so he was excluded from the church anyway, but without his organ, technically. So these fundamentalists, they often quote the word, thus says the Lord. Okay, and this is a rule for everything. Sometimes I hear those arguments in so many different contexts, even when we discuss the issue of ordination. People saying, women should not teach because that's what Paul says, or women should cover their hair. If those people went a bit more into the background of culture, or if they understood that Bible is always coming as a result of this dynamic process. God inspires human author, but allows individuality and creativity, even culture and philosophy at the time, to shape and package this message. So you always have these human elements, therefore the need to study historically and culturally Adventism, but also you have divine principles there. If they had this mindset about the Bible, then they would reason different about this principle, do not cover your hair. Because if you don't cover your hair, you live in Corinth of the first century, the harbor city, which guys come there, as sailors. They're looking for somebody who will lure them, with whom they will sexually engage. People girls who have big hair, and they're usually very sophisticated and educated, because these were the profile of people that were prostitutes at the time. People who get these special skills, to entice the man. If you didn't cover your hair, you would be regarded automatically as a prostitute. So Apostle Paul knows that if there is a woman not covering hair in this particular town, we are sending a wrong message to the world around about immodesty, about perversion, about immorality. This is not what you ought to achieve. Adjust to the context. Do that, even though this is not what God requires you to do. Like it's not sin before God not to cover hair, but for the cultural context, you need to adapt. If he was to do this exactly same thing in Jerusalem, there, if you cover the hair, means that you're a prostitute. So one principle meaning different things in different environments, okay? And so therefore, those fundamentalists, they cannot perceive that. They'll usually fight the not historical, but progressive ones saying, no, you want to relativize everything, just a matter of culture. No, this is the pure word of God. Yes?
I'm just asking about right now.
Yes.
I was speaking to a member from a church, and they were saying how right now there's like a movement within the church where they said that it came from the general conference, this movement of we shouldn't be looking at the historical background of the text and the culture of the text, but read it as it is in the present day and how we understand in the present day. Where does this fit into this? And because from what you said now, that's not a healthy approach to the text.
So, okay. So let's try to imagine now, for the sake of answering this question, we need to add a bit of a hermeneutical tool, hermeneutical triangle. So there is, when you interpret the text, there is always three aspects you're looking for. What the text says, okay, text itself, you're looking for a text, you're looking for the author of the text, and you're looking for the reader of the text. If you neglect any one of those, you get into distortion. Those fundamentalists, they would insist on the text itself, but they would not necessarily regard what was the intention of the text, what was the direct historical, theological problem that the author is dealing with, You deal with those questions if you deal with the author. You want to understand what his worldview, what are his conviction, his intention for the text, and so on. So the historicals, I would say, they were still a bit more balanced. They try to regard the text itself and the author in the intention, but still they do not have all the methods to do that. Fundamentally, they're really just into text. But currently, we are recognizing more new interpretations that you can never approach the text without importing your own layers of meaning, your own values. And the words which you read today, what you think author actually thought is not as you think this is obvious, but this is actually something else what author wanted to say 2,000 years ago. There's a big cultural gap between us, linguistic gap between us, philosophical gap. So your interpretation has to go back to dig into the time and to understand the text. So these new interpretations who would say we need to understand just what it means today, if you neglect what it meant then, you don't have any external criteria to really regulate your interpretation. So what you end up doing is just projecting your own opinion. You're yelling into the well, hearing your own voice. Or you're looking in the mirror, you just see yourself, not the text. So this is the process of interpretation is always radically a deconstructionist step, that you need to deconstruct yourself, where you're approaching from. This is what we are doing today. We want to see where we're coming from before we actually enter the biblical text in the next class, okay? And this is, I think all of those are deviations. We need all of those, text, author, and the reader, to be aware of those elements because they feed into each other. Somehow, this is a circular process. The more we know about a text, the more we will try to, the more accurately we will reconstruct the context of the author. And the more we know that, the more we have the ways to measure what opinions today and what interpretations are more normative and more accurate and trustworthy, and what are just subjective and unregulated interpretations. So this is how I would technically try to answer that. Yeah? So with fundamentalists, there's a strong emphasis on a text. Even historical Adventists, they are talking about expounding of the meaning of the words in the literary and historical context. Historical grammatical method focuses mostly on a text, but this historical grammatical method also tries to reach towards the author a bit. So I don't think that they...
Fundamental.
What, right?
So it would be fundamental then?
Yes, fundamental text and historical, moving slowly from text to author. But neither one of those is actually aware of the read and response theory that we are importing. At the time, they had this Scottish common sense philosophy that the way you perceive things is the way how... This is intrinsic to every human being. Once you face everybody with same arguments and facts, they'll come to exact same conclusion as you. So this is something naive. This was happening as a result of Millerite method of reading the Bible. Yeah, so you learn about it. There are other elements like Baconian method as well as rationalism and deism which influence the reading of the Bible. But technically, they're not aware of the more complex process of interpretation. Only later our movement tried to develop. Now let me reveal for a moment a bit of a dirty laundry from our church past for the sake of edification. 1919 conference, Bible conference about interpretation. Leaders closed in a group awaited for the whole congregation for them to come out and tell their decisions. They're struggling what to do because there is a big division. They taught for decades certain theory of inspiration, even how to understand Ellen G. White. And now they found themselves to be victims of their own teaching, but they were not ready to face the consequences. So they were teaching about this Bible is infallible, it's how do we call it? Inerrant, okay? And then people took this particular theory and started to apply it to every word of Ellen G. White, that every word is a seed of the Holy Spirit. So there is every single word that she ever wrote is only inspired, even in her private letters. And this was starting to be very damaging, you know. Ellen White, she fought against this theory. She also was claiming the Bible is not perfect. We find all sorts of mistakes there. In her own writings, she never called perfect. But now she's dead, already 4 years at the time. Yeah, she died in 1915. This is 1919. So there is nobody who will defend her writing and explain to people how they should interpret her texts. If now these leaders come about and admit to them that we were actually at the editing team revising her text and different 4 versions of Great Controversy, and each one of them is very different, if you notice, you know. And we were also involved in the process of meaning making and so on. They will be seen as apostatizing church because you can't touch one word from the prophet and without being guilty before the judgment. Daniels, he was very closely working with Ellen G. White. He says, okay, let's tell them the truth, you know, that there are some parts which are less perfect, which is not, you know, this is not the seed of the Holy Spirit. It's just our human effort to express certain things, you know, certain visions from God. But then he was opposed very strongly. So they decided for the sake of unity, and now because this was a time of ending of the First World War and all the other issues and crises in church, they said, okay, let's keep this document for future generations who can deal with it. Currently, we need to live with the consequences of our decisions. So they maintain the theory of verbal inspiration, never officially admitting it, but this is the direction which they took. After this meeting, no wonder Daniels was immediately removed from presidential office, and Haskell and others came here. The first Bible Quarterly was about inerrancy of the Bible, responding to the current trends, you know. So there was a embarrassing period in the history of our church of 10 years or so that people actually went for it, you know. But we have to understand them. This is the world which you can whether be liberal and scientific or fundamentalist. There is no middle way. This is how strong the battle was in 1920s. So for them to try to find the middle ground, they will be sided here and there. They will send a mixed message about Adventism, and they wanted to support the Bible. At that time, certain trend appeared in our church to constantly talk about science defends the Bible, archaeology defends the Bible, you know. You see what they are responding to? To the challenge of modernism and scientific times. Those progressives on the other side, they said, okay, maybe we don't have to be so black and white. Maybe we should recognize the genre of first, like Genesis, is actually not necessarily a historical account. This is more like a poetry, emphasis in certain theological truth, like God is the one creating us. Whether it is really as it says so, like by His word, and there are a lot of inconsistencies in a text, even impossibilities. How can you have the light without sun and the other objects which are created on day 4? And these kind of inconsistencies. They said maybe we should think about different versions, that evolution gives us the right way. This is the theistic evolution. Let's accept evolution and stay Christians, And this is then seen as somehow more grounded in history, in science. Science tells us how things function around us, while the Bible revealed the ultimate cause of our creation and the purpose of creation. So religion and science should be partners, each one interpreting certain aspect of reality. So this is usually the mindset of this progressive Adventists, and you can find them mostly in academia and people interacting with different sciences. They have tendency to interpret the Bible this particular way. Okay, let's try to move on. And in 5 minutes we need to finish with this section. We also have something which we call ecumenical Adventism in 1950s, when ecumenism becomes one of the dominant moves of Christianity, the movement of Christian unity. And people saying that, why would we emphasize our specific distinctive identity? We are Christians after all. We should enter this dialogue and just immerse ourselves completely. Who cares whether you're called Adventist or not? So this is a kind of reasoning. On the other side, we can imagine how historical Adventists perceive this as imminent danger because you're losing your distinctives. Yes?
How popular is ecumenical Adventism? Because I've heard of the other ones, but ecumenical I've maybe a little, but not really as strongly as the fundamentals, historicals, evangelists, and progressives. Mm-hmm. So how popular is that movement within the Adventist Church?
Yes. I don't see it too often, because the moment if somebody openly declares themselves as ecumenical, they would be seen as enemy of the church. But there are people who simply have more tolerant views of others, saying, okay, I actually think that this Catholic, even this Jesuit, is the Son of God, and I can see true Christianity there, so let me be a good friend with the person and let me try to negotiate. And so they're slightly less prejudicial towards others, less close-minded also, that God can speak to other movements also, and we can learn from them. So I'm talking more about the inclusive attitude of we can learn about truth if we take the totality of God's revelation, not only in Adventism, but also outside the walls of this church, extra ecclesiam, but extra church of Adventism, okay? So they're open for this idea that we can even learn from Muslims, we can learn from Hindu people, we can learn from others. So this kind of Adventists, I'm naming ecumenical. I don't see them too often, though. On the other side, we have something which we call cultural. Here, I'm not sure whether each one of those is actually cultural. It's a very vague sense of word. I took it as a separate strand, although I can see that somehow, although other strands are certain subcultures, okay? But what I thought, why did I differentiate this particular strand is there is certain kind of people or group of people who always search for their theological project, and they search in the culture around them. Basically saying, we need to be in, we need to follow the trends. So now if we talk to postmoderns, better speak their language, and do everything which works in current time. And because if you speak in different ways, how modernists will speak, you will not be appealing to people here. So they're talking about contextualization and relevancy, which is very important for Christian message, because otherwise nobody will understand you technically. So it's important to be relevant. After all, that's why this module is also here, to help us update our language about the church, to be relevant in today's world, because we have different questions, different challenges, different culture that we are responding to. But if this becomes your only project, if culture becomes your only project, you will tend to lose transformative power in the culture. You will stop to be a counter-cultural project or movement who is challenging certain values, or let's say capitalism or consumerism and so on. So cultural Adventists are very useful because it's usually those people who are modern, who follow, following social media and knowing what's going on around them. Very literate, culturally literate. At the same time, you discover that they lost their own sense of identity. So what is it that you offer to this culture which is different, which is actually enriching culture for better? That's where they're lacking. So now let me ask you, for the end, the final question. Unless, I think I saw your hand before. Is it now?
I think it's out of context now.
Out of context now, yes. So where would you go if you were to recommend the road for Adventism today in SDA, Seventh-day Adventist Church in 2018. What do you think is the right way of being Adventist then?
It's going around and around and around, getting the best out of all.
Okay. Getting best out of all. That would mean technically harmonizing or picking and choosing what's good, what's bad.
Yeah, in a way.
Uh-huh.
I am more for the cultural. I like the cultural, but I don't think the cultural has all of the answers
Uh-huh.
that you need. And nor
Okay.
does all of them. I mean, none of them has it all.
Can we try to find our identity on a dialogue between all these different trends, or are they
Yeah.
so opposed that
Mhm.
a dialogue is impossible at this
Mm.
time?
So technically, are you talking about some kind of pluralist approach that whatever they say is valid, or whatever they say, and dialogue will lead us to a full understanding?
Whatever they say, some things they say, I think.
Ah, okay. So how would that look like then? How would you help Adventism move on and unite?
Maybe comparing the movements with the Bible.
Okay. So you're talking about criteria of selection. So Bible being the interpretandum, technically meaning the object interpreted. We are choosing the criteria, the judge among us, yeah?
But then again, what does that mean?
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
The moment you ask-
Yeah.
I think that's-
everyone, I guess, is trying to look at it from the perspective of the Bible, regardless of where they're coming from.
Yeah.
Evangelical or fundamental or historical or progressive or cultural, they have the Bible somehow as their
Common denominator.
drive. Yeah, common denominators, their driving force.
Yes.
So, what does that mean then?
What is your
Uh-huh. So I would also agree, this is a good suggestion, okay, take the common criteria, but as João said, okay, even cultural would say, Jesus is our example. He came here, he became human being, he became a Jew, he was culturally conditioned also, and he was incarnated, incarnational ministry. We find the example from him, because otherwise we would not be able to understand God. We always function within the culture, so we better do the same thing what Jesus did. So you see, they are totally biblical. But then we also have fundamentalists who say the church is the fortress of truth, and the whole Bible is this depository of timeless truth of God, which are untouched by the human change around us. We need to pass the purity of the truth and integrity of the truth to our next generation. So that's also biblical. I would say, yes, we need to do that.
Well, there are positives and negatives in every single
Uh-huh.
movement. And I guess our task is to analyze those positives and negatives and kind of balance them and bring them together
Yes.
and root out the negatives,
Uh-huh.
pick the positives,
Okay.
and kind of build a new route, so to say, with those positives and moving forward. Using, because every single movement has a point. Like
Yes.
they're not there just because, or they're not completely distorted.
Yes.
They all carry some kind of truth,
Yes, yes.
and we should take the truth that each fraction has,
Yes.
that they're right now keeping to themselves and thinking that is the only way.
Yes.
We could be like, well, that is one way, and we like this way, so we're gonna take this part, maybe not that other side of this,
Yes.
but so picking and choosing from
From each
kind of-
direction.
from each direction, what is good and what is beneficial and what is biblically founded, I guess.
Yes.
Because not everything in the movements is going to be biblically defendable.
Yes, yes, yes.
Of course, yes, there's the question of we ourselves are going to be influenced by our culture and our backgrounds and our understandings of the Bible. But if we communicate, as João was saying, with every single route, then there'll be like a meeting of sorts. So if, for example, if historicals and evangelicals, if we look at something from historical, something from an evangelical, they can start balancing out each other, kind of like how acid and something non-acidic can kind of
Mixed together.
mix together and make it something consumable.
Yes.
So, just take both ends and bring it together, and then choose what matches and what can be carried forward.
And for the criteria of selection, you would use Bible as an ultimate criteria, yeah?
But Tihi,
Yes.
I wonder if, when you're talking about groups, as you said, fundamental Adventism tends to see their way as the only way. I mean, all of them see themselves as the only way.
Yes.
So then how can we actually, and that's perhaps defeating my own question, how can we actually engage in conversation if my way is the only way? So I wonder if it has to do less with knowledge, because all of these are very much focused on knowledge and with something else.
Yes. Now we can see the complication of, okay, you can say we want to be biblical and criteria is the Bible, but they all approach the Bible. There's something good in each one of them. You can't accept it by default, so there has to be some kind of dialogue. So what I see here, there is 4 methodological options that we have. One, to continue where we are, to function within one particular strand. Let's say you are historical Adventist or you are evangelical. Then you try to reason from that particular perspective and then try to maybe enhance it by taking some of the theology of others. So this is one single metaphor approach. But then already we now see, as you noticed rightly, that this is some kind of reductionist. You have blind spots. You simply can't address all the questions looking at one particular strand. This forces you to move on methodologically to a second step, which is eclecticism. You pick and choose good aspects from each. Because culturals are good when talking about how to relate to the current world. Fundamentalists with their passion for something which is timeless, and their determination not to compromise their faith. There are some good things in that too. Progressive with their open mind to really analyze where God is around in different disciplines, different sciences, and that's excellent. Evangelicals recognizing that Christ actually prayed for us to be one. What if you can find goodness in this kind of unity and learn from others? So we can try to pick and choose good aspects, but then avoid the distortions. So this is a third methodological option. So first, single metaphor or single strand approach. Second one is eclectic. But the moment you start to pick and choose, you will notice that you are very subjective in the process. Different people would pick and choose very differently. So there is a need of some kind of more harmonious thinking, more overarching, big picture thinking. So this leads us to this option of harmonization. Maintain good aspects from each, avoid negative aspects. How do you do that? And you rightly pointed out, well, again, we are searching for criteria. We need to, take the Bible as a criteria, but more than that, maybe some principles of interpretation of Bible. Maybe hermeneutics is the area how we'll proceed towards unity. So, but then you're talking about creating a new pathway, which is bigger than the previous one, encompasses everything else what is good, but it's something fresh, something new, which has a continuity with the past, but it's adaptation, it's something better than what the previous offered. Then you're talking about the root of innovation. So single strand, eclectic method, harmonization, innovation, any you pick will require thinking about different legitimate theological concerns from each one of those. But not each of those methodological options is good enough. I would tend to go towards this innovation to say, maybe we have to think in fresh categories to provide a bigger framework, which will reason from the standpoint of Bible. That's a minimum common denominator. Each one of them would like to see as people of the book, So that's nobody complain against that. Let's take this common ground as a common interpretandum and then develop the discussion about hermeneutics. What are the principles which guide our understanding? And then try to, on the basis of that, to see, what are then biblical aspects and what are not biblical aspects coming from those. And this is, I think, which widely speaking, in very general terms, is a direction. Creating a biblical Adventism is always going closer to the core of what Adventism is, the people of the book. Now, how do we do that is the topic of the next class. And I would like you, meanwhile, to think between now and the next class to think, okay, so what it means to be biblical Adventism. So what goes in, what goes out, where do we navigate the church? That's technically a question that you as leaders of the church will need to learn how to answer. Where do you take your church? Where do you lead them? Towards what vision? How do you make them passionate for this particular pathway? For this moment, I think we could stop here and just reiterate that this knowledge can actually help you to increase your own outlook if you find yourself within one of those. It can be as a mirror to you. Also, this map of this roundabout can help you to adjust your methods when you work in different churches. So how would you approach the church which is very fundamentalist, You don't speak the language of ecumenical person there. You start where they are, but then try to push them towards middle, And this is usually something which the skill that needs to be learned, how to speak sensitive language, and then to build the common ground once they buy you as a person, and then introduce certain aspects that they are lacking. Often Kat and myself have a discussion regarding how this should function. She's more a confrontational person that from the start you know exactly what you're dealing with, because she will tell you and you better deal with it, okay? While myself, she called me something as a Jesuit, or some person who likes to infiltrate. I first learn about a person. I want to see what are the legitimate concerns that this person has and need. Okay, and then I ask the question, so how can I help this person to go forward? How can I learn from that person, first of all? What can I learn about the person? And then what are the words I can use to enhance this particular vision? So it's a different approach, technically. Both of them are necessary for change. I'm not trying to say the one is more superior than the other. But I think there is a wisdom of you when you go to your church to exactly know where it is on this scale, and then how to lead step by step over time towards the middle. So they can start to appreciate others, to foster the spirit of dialogue and openness to others. So next class we are talking about trying to go deeper to see what is biblical. What is it all about? Why biblical? Isn't Christ fuller revelation than Bible? Isn't that the ultimate relation of God? And the truth itself, isn't that a wider phenomena and wider quest of ours? We're going to discuss that. And you will then see how this particular framework helps you to shape biblical ecclesiology. So instead of just creating ecclesiology for one of the strands in this module, we want to create a comprehensive vision that will unite those strands, which will help us maintain this common Adventist identity, but recognize the plurality of this framework. So this is what we are aiming at. So this is a particular river that we stand as interpreters of the Bible. And now when we go to the next stage of our discovery, we're going to go into the past to learn from the past how ecclesiology is done. And then we're going to see how can we create ecclesiology which is wide enough to encompass different concerns without maintaining those disruptive and those distortion elements in it. So we are working towards the common, wider vision of what it means to be Seventh-day Adventist. Thank you very much for participation. Next time we're exploring what it means to be biblical Adventists, or how to create a biblical ecclesiology.